The sun was shining brightly in the quiet park. It was a perfect day for a stroll, and most people were enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. Among them was a black old man in his 70s, sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of a large tree. His name was Mr. Ellis, but to most people, he was just the old man who came to the park every day to read his book. He was calm, patient, and always seemed to be lost in his thoughts, living his life with a quiet sense of peace. A group of teenagers, no older than 16, were hanging out near the entrance of the park, laughing and talking loudly. They wore casual clothes, baggy jeans, hoodies, and sneakers, making them look like any other group of teens trying to pass the time. But as they walked past the old man, their attention was drawn to him. Mr. Ellis sat completely still, his face calm and unreadable. One of the teens, a tall boy with a cocky smile, noticed the old man's peaceful appearance and felt a sudden urge to make a joke at his expense. "Look at that guy," he said, nudging his friends. "What's he doing here? Just sitting there like he's got all the time in the world. What a weirdo." The others chuckled, and one of them threw in, "He's probably too old to even move. Think he's trying to look wise or something." They all laughed louder now, thinking they were being clever. The old man didn't react. He just kept reading his book, his eyes scanning the pages with calm focus. To the teens, it felt like the perfect moment to have a little fun. One of them, a girl with short hair and a mischievous grin, walked up to the old man. "Hey, Gramps," she called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's so interesting in that book? You even understand what it says?" Mr. Ellis looked up slowly, his eyes kind but firm. "It's just a story, young lady," he said in a quiet voice. "Nothing special." The teens were surprised by his calm response. They were used to older people getting upset when they were being teased, but this old man wasn't reacting like anyone they knew. Instead of getting angry or defensive, he simply answered with a smile and went back to his reading. This only seemed to amuse the teens more. They started to throw out even more rude comments, hoping to get a reaction. They figured the old man would get angry and show some emotion, something that would make them feel powerful. But to their disappointment, Mr. Ellis kept his composure. It was as if they weren't even there. "Why don't you do something useful with your time, old man?" one of the boys sneered. "You really think you can teach us anything with that book? What do you even know about the world today?" But Mr. Ellis didn't respond this time. He simply smiled again, his eyes twinkling slightly as he turned the page of his book. The teens were starting to grow frustrated. Why wasn't he getting angry? Wasn't he supposed to stand up for himself? The old man seemed completely at peace, as if nothing could disturb his calm. Meanwhile, the teens, growing bored and even more frustrated, started to make their way around him, deciding they would have to do something more to get him to react. They didn't know it yet, but the old man was about to show them a lesson they would never forget. As they circled him, talking louder and louder, they never imagined who Mr. Ellis truly was. They didn't know that the calm man reading his book had once been one of the greatest martial artists in the world, a karate master who could easily defend himself if he wanted to. But for now, he stayed silent, letting the teens think what they wanted. He knew when to act, and when to let people learn on their own. The teasing from the teens continued, and the situation was beginning to feel uncomfortable for Mr. Ellis. The group of young people had circled around him now, laughing loudly and pointing at him. They couldn't understand why this old man, sitting quietly in the park, didn't seem to care about their taunts. In their eyes, he was just an easy target. His calmness confused them. They were used to getting reactions, to seeing people either get upset or try to defend themselves. But the old man remained unmoved, his focus still on the book in his hands. One of the boys, frustrated by the lack of response, decided to step things up. He took a step closer to Mr. Ellis and nudged him lightly with his foot. "Come on, old man. Don't you want to do something? Maybe tell us about the good old days," he said with a grin. trying to make his voice sound friendly. But his words were anything but friendly. The boy was now clearly mocking the old man, eager to get him to react in some way. The other teens laughed, egging him on. Mr. Ellis didn't even look up. He merely adjusted his glasses and turned a page, his expression soft but unchanging. This seemed to irritate the teens even more. They didn't know what to make of him. Why wasn't he angry? Why wasn't he shouting back or getting up to challenge them? "Hey, did you hear me?" the girl from before asked. She took a few steps closer and stood in front of him, hands on her hips. "You too old to hear," she said, almost sneering. Still, Mr. Ellis said nothing. The teens were now starting to wonder if he even understood what they were saying, or if he was simply ignoring them on purpose. They were so used to the usual reactions: anger, embarrassment, maybe even a fight. But here was this old man sitting quietly, like he wasn't bothered by their words at all. The boy who had first started the teasing, feeling increasingly challenged by the old man's indifference, decided to go further. He leaned over Mr. Ellis and, with a mocking tone, said, "Come on, what are you going to do about it? Are you really just going to sit there all day like some statue?" The old man continued to ignore him, his gaze still fixed on the pages of the book. For a moment, the teens thought he might just get up and walk away. But instead, there was a slight shift in his body. He closed the book gently and placed it on his lap. His movements were slow, deliberate, and calm, as if he had all the time in the world. At that moment, something about the old man's posture made the teens stop laughing. There was a change in the air, a shift they couldn't explain. The cocky smiles that had been plastered on their faces started to fade. For the first time, they felt a little uncertain. Why was this old man, who had been so quiet and patient, suddenly so calm? The tension between them grew, but Mr. Ellis said nothing. He simply looked at them, his eyes kind but firm. There was a quiet strength in him, something that none of the teens had noticed before. He stood up slowly, towering over them for the first time. The old man didn't look like he was about to fight or yell. No, his presence seemed to carry a deeper message. The teens, unsure of what to expect next, stood still, waiting for him to speak. But it wasn't words they would hear first. It would be his actions that would speak volumes. The moment was coming, and the teens, still unsure of who he really was, were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The teens stood frozen, unsure of what was about to happen next. The old man, Mr. Ellis, had stood up slowly, and the air around them seemed to change. The once laughing group now found themselves quietly watching him, unsure of what to do. The old man didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The teens had been so used to bullying people and seeing them get angry, upset, or even leave. But this time, it was different. The old man wasn't like anyone they had teased before. He was still, calm, and completely collected. He didn't yell or get defensive. He didn't look scared either. He simply stood there, looking at them with steady eyes that seemed to say, "I know what you're doing, but I won't let you control me." One of the boys, trying to regain some sense of control, stepped forward, puffing out his chest and trying to look tough. "What, you think you're too good for us, huh?" he said, though his voice now seemed uncertain. "You think we won't do anything to you?" Mr. Ellis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the boy and took a deep breath. The teens were watching him closely now, waiting for him to speak or react. The old man's movements were so smooth, so deliberate, that it felt like he was in complete control of the situation. Without a word, he began to take a few steps back, placing some space between himself and the teens. They thought he might be backing down, maybe even trying to avoid conflict. But in that moment, Mr. Ellis wasn't avoiding anything. He was preparing. The boy who had spoken stepped closer, his friends watching, their curiosity growing. "I don't think you get it," the boy said, getting closer. "We're just having fun. You should loosen up, old man." But before the words could leave his mouth completely, the unexpected happened. In the blink of an eye, Mr. Ellis moved. It wasn't fast enough for the boy to fully process. In a single fluid motion, the old man's hand shot out, grabbing the boy by the wrist and twisting it just enough to disarm him of his arrogant attitude. The boy stumbled back, his face turning pale. The old man, though still not looking angry, had made his point clear. He was not someone to be underestimated. The teens gasped. This wasn't what they had expected. The old man, who they had thought was defenseless, had not only stood up for himself, but had done so with a calmness that was more powerful than any fight they had ever witnessed. The boy was still in shock, rubbing his wrist where the old man had held him, trying to understand what had just happened. The group of teens stood speechless, their laughter gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than anything they had experienced. The calmness in the old man's eyes didn't shift. He hadn't yelled at them or pushed them away. He had simply shown them that there was power in being calm, that sometimes words and threats weren't necessary. For a brief moment, there was only the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze, the kind of silence that made the teens realize how wrong they had been. Mr. Ellis didn't need to prove himself to them. His actions alone had been enough to silence their mocking, and that realization hung in the air, making the group rethink their actions. The old man finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Respect is earned, not demanded," he said. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I've lived a long life, and the only thing I've learned is that kindness is the strongest force you can have. But don't mistake my calm for weakness." The teens stood still, their expressions a mix of confusion, realization, and even a little shame. They had come to the park expecting an easy target, but instead they had faced a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The old man hadn't needed to raise his voice. He had raised theirs. The moment was silent, but it spoke volumes. The teens, who had once been so sure of themselves, were now left standing in stunned silence. The old man, Mr. Ellis, had not only defended himself without raising his voice or losing his calm, but he had also taught them a valuable lesson in the process. The calmness he had shown in the face of their teasing and mockery was more powerful than anything they could have imagined. As the group stood there, trying to process what had just happened, their minds began to wander, and they started to notice the little details about Mr. Ellis they hadn't paid attention to before. The way his posture was straight, even for someone of his age, suggested that he had spent years maintaining discipline. His eyes, though old, had a certain sharpness to them that made it clear he wasn't someone who had lived an ordinary life. It was almost as if the old man had a story to tell, a story they had no idea about. One of the teens, a girl who had been silent through most of the exchange, stepped forward cautiously. She had been the one to make the first sarcastic comment about the old man reading his book. She felt the weight of her words now, and her conscience was starting to catch up with her. "We didn't mean any harm," she said, her voice softer than before. "We were just having fun. We didn't think you'd actually do anything." Mr. Ellis gave her a kind smile, though it was clear that he wasn't angry. "I understand," he said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes we forget that our words can have more power than we realize. But it's important to remember that respect goes both ways. You don't have to like everyone, but kindness is always a choice." The teens looked at each other, realizing the truth in his words. They had been so caught up in trying to impress each other, in trying to act tough, that they hadn't even noticed how their words had affected the old man. They hadn't thought about how someone might feel being the target of jokes, no matter how harmless they seemed at the time. Mr. Ellis paused for a moment, allowing the teens to reflect on what he had said. Then he surprised them again. Instead of walking away or continuing to scold them, he invited them to sit with him. "If you're truly curious," he said, "I'll share my story with you. Maybe you'll understand a little more about why I don't let things like that bother me." The teens hesitated. They had expected him to walk away, to give them a harsh lesson in humility. But instead, the old man was offering something far more valuable: understanding. After a few moments of silence, one of the boys, the one who had first challenged Mr. Ellis, took a step forward. "What's your story?" he asked, his tone now more respectful. Mr. Ellis smiled again, and slowly he began to tell them a story, one that would change the way they saw him, and perhaps the way they saw themselves as well. He spoke about his life, about how he had grown up in a different time, a time when strength and discipline were not just physical but mental as well. He told them about his many years of training in karate, about how he had traveled the world and learned from the best martial artists. He explained how, through all his experiences, he had come to understand the true power of calmness, patience, and kindness. As the old man spoke, the teens listened intently. They could hear the wisdom in his words, the life lessons that could only come from a man who had seen so much. It was no longer just about the physical act of defending oneself. It was about how one carried themselves through life, how they interacted with others, and how they chose to deal with challenges. By the time Mr. Ellis finished his story, the teens had all gathered around him, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. They had been humbled not by the old man's ability to fight, but by his ability to teach them something far more important, something that would stick with them long after that day. The old man's lesson had been simple, but powerful. True strength comes not from what you can do to others, but from how you choose to respond to the world around you. And sometimes, the greatest act of strength is the quietest one: choosing peace, even in the face of mockery. The teens sat quietly around Mr. Ellis, their attention fully captured by the story he had just shared. For the first time, they weren't looking for ways to challenge him or prove themselves. Instead, they were listening to a man whose life had been filled with experiences they could only begin to understand. The atmosphere had completely shifted from one of mockery and defiance to one of genuine curiosity and respect. Mr. Ellis had finished his story, and there was a brief moment of silence. The teens, still processing what they had heard, exchanged glances. No one spoke at first. It was as if they were each waiting for someone else to break the silence. Finally, one of the boys, who had been one of the loudest in the group, spoke up. "I didn't know you were a karate master," he said, his voice almost sheepish. "You've got to be really strong, right?" Mr. Ellis smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile they had expected. It wasn't one of pride or boastfulness. It was a smile of understanding, as though he had been expecting this question all along. "Strength isn't just about how strong your body is," he replied, his voice calm. "True strength is the ability to control yourself, to know when to act and when to stay still. The power isn't in the punches or kicks. It's in the mind and in the heart." The boy nodded slowly, trying to absorb the meaning of the old man's words. For the first time, he understood that what Mr. Ellis had shown them wasn't just a lesson in physical combat. It was a lesson in life. The way Mr. Ellis had stood his ground without raising his fists, the way he had remained calm and composed even when they tried to push him, was a powerful example of inner strength. "Does that mean you could have, fought us if you wanted to?" another boy asked, sounding a bit embarrassed for the first time. "Like, if you wanted to, could you have beaten us up?" Mr. Ellis chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not about fighting," he said. "I've spent years learning martial arts, but not to hurt others. I've trained so that I can protect myself if needed, but more importantly, I've learned when not to fight at all. The true challenge is controlling your impulses and knowing when to walk away." The teens looked at each other, the weight of his words sinking in. They had expected the old man to tell them about the countless fights he had won, or how powerful he was in combat. But instead, he had shared something much deeper, something that went beyond physical strength. For a moment, they were all lost in thought. The girl who had first approached Mr. Ellis earlier, the one who had been the most mocking, now spoke up. "So, you mean you could have hurt us, but you chose not to?" Mr. Ellis nodded, his eyes kind but firm. Exactly. I could have tried to show you how strong I am, but that wouldn't have taught you anything. What would have been the point of hurting you? Sometimes, the greatest strength comes from showing mercy and understanding, not power. The group was silent again. They were all starting to understand that Mr. Ellis wasn't just teaching them about karate. He was teaching them about life. He had shown them that strength wasn't measured by how much force you could use on someone else, but by how much control you had over yourself and your actions. After a long pause, the boy who had challenged Mr. Ellis earlier spoke up again, his voice quieter now. I get it. I really do. I've never thought about it like that before. I always thought that to be strong, you had to be tough, you know. But you've made me realize that strength is about more than just being tough. Mr. Ellis smiled gently at the boy. You're learning. That's what matters. The rest of the group nodded, each of them thinking about the lesson they had just received. It wasn't just about what Mr. Ellis had done in the park. It was about how they could change their own behavior moving forward. They had been given the chance to see things from a different perspective, and it was a chance they weren't going to waste. Thanks, one of the teens said. Thanks for teaching us. We'll think about it next time. Mr. Ellis nodded, his smile warm but knowing. It's never too late to learn, he said softly. And remember, the strongest people are the ones who can be kind when others are being cruel. As the teens began to leave, they did so with a new understanding of strength and the importance of controlling their impulses. They had learned something more important than any fight. They had learned what it meant to be truly strong. And Mr. Ellis, watching them go, knew that they would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. The teens walked away from Mr. Ellis, their minds buzzing with thoughts they had never considered before. They had come to the park looking for trouble, expecting an easy target in the old man sitting on the bench. But now they were leaving with a new perspective on life, and a lesson they would never forget. It was strange, really. They had thought they were the ones in control, but in the end, it had been Mr. Ellis who had taught them the most important lesson of all. As they walked back toward the entrance of the park, the atmosphere was completely different from how it had been when they first arrived. Gone were the loud, mocking comments. Gone was the feeling of power they had felt just a short time ago. Now the group was quieter, more thoughtful. The teasing had stopped, replaced by a sense of reflection. They were no longer thinking about how to show off or impress each other. They were thinking about the words Mr. Ellis had spoken, about his calm demeanor, and about the strength he had shown, not through his fists, but through his mind and heart. One of the boys, the one who had been the most vocal in the beginning, turned to the others. I don't know about you guys, but I feel kind of dumb now, he said, scratching the back of his neck. We were just messing around, but he really made me think. Another boy nodded. Yeah, I never thought about it like that. I always thought that if someone said something rude, you had to fight back or something. But he just showed us that you don't have to do that. The girl who had approached Mr. Ellis earlier added, I didn't think an old man could teach me something like that. But he was so calm, like he was in control of everything. It makes me realize how much I don't think before I speak sometimes. They all agreed. It was strange to think that just moments ago, they had been mocking him, assuming he was weak because of his age. But now, after hearing his story and seeing how he had handled the situation, they understood that true strength came from within. It was about knowing who you were, being at peace with yourself, and choosing to be kind, even when others were being cruel. As they continued to walk, one of the boys spoke up again, this time with more respect in his voice. I wonder how many other people like him there are, you know. People who are just living their lives and not getting caught up in the drama. I think I'd want to be more like him. The others nodded in agreement. They had all learned something important today, something that was going to stick with them for a long time. They had come to the park with the intention of teasing and causing trouble, but in the end, they had learned a lesson about strength, kindness, and the power of control. Meanwhile, Mr. Ellis had returned to his bench under the tree. He sat down slowly, picking up his book again, as though nothing had happened. But in his heart, he knew that something important had changed. It wasn't about the brief encounter with the teens. It was about the impact he had made, the small shift in their thinking that would ripple out into their lives. They might not even realize it yet, but he had planted a seed of understanding, respect, and kindness. Mr. Ellis wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He didn't need them to thank him or acknowledge what he had done. For him, the lesson was complete as soon as they left the park. He knew that the real change happened within them, not in any physical act or grand gesture. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons came from the simplest moments, from showing kindness when it wasn't expected, from showing strength without the need for words. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Mr. Ellis closed his book and took a deep breath, content in the knowledge that he had done his part. He had shared his wisdom, and now it was up to the teens to carry it with them. And as he watched them leave, he knew that, in some way, they would be better for it. The lesson wasn't just about karate or physical strength. It was about becoming better people, something he had always strived for in his own life. The following days passed by, but the encounter with Mr. Ellis stayed in the teens' minds. They had each returned to their routines, but something had shifted. The carefree attitude they had once shared, the mocking and joking, was now replaced with a sense of introspection. They had all come to realize that they weren't the same as before. That simple meeting in the park had planted a thought in their minds, a thought that continued to grow and change their perspective on life. For some of the teens, it was a subtle change. They noticed that they were less quick to make jokes at the expense of others. They began to think before speaking, wondering how their words might affect those around them. It wasn't something they had done intentionally, but somehow, their interactions with others became more respectful. They weren't looking to cause trouble or make people feel bad anymore. Instead, they started focusing on kindness, on being the better version of themselves, just as Mr. Ellis had shown them. One afternoon, as they were all hanging out together, the same boy who had initially mocked Mr. Ellis spoke up. "I think I'm starting to get it more now," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Like, sometimes it's just better to let stuff go, you know. It's not worth fighting over the small stuff. And honestly, I don't want to be the guy who makes people feel bad anymore." His friends nodded in agreement. They were starting to see the world a little differently, and they knew that their actions had consequences. There was a power in choosing to be kind, and it was something they had never considered before. But now that they had learned it, they couldn't unlearn it. The girl who had first approached Mr. Ellis also seemed to be affected by the encounter. She had always been the one to joke around the most, not really thinking about how her words might affect others. But now she found herself holding back, catching herself before she said something rude or sarcastic. She realized that humor didn't have to come at the expense of someone else. It didn't have to be hurtful. Even the quieter teens, the ones who had stayed silent during the entire episode in the park, felt a shift in their behavior. They started to speak up more, not to make fun of others, but to offer encouragement and support. They understood now that they had a choice in how they made others feel, and they wanted to make that choice count. Weeks went by, and Mr. Ellis's lesson continued to resonate with them. They didn't realize it at first, but they had all been carrying the lesson with them, learning how to handle difficult situations with grace and respect. They had started to approach life a little more carefully, with more thoughtfulness in their hearts, and without even intending to, they had become better friends to one another. One day, they found themselves back at the park again, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the trees. As they walked past the bench where Mr. Ellis had been sitting that fateful day, they stopped and looked at the spot. It was empty, just as it had been before. They hadn't seen him again since that day, but his presence was still felt, lingering in the lessons he had taught them. "I wonder if he's still out there," the boy who had spoken up earlier said. "I hope he's okay." The girl who had apologized to Mr. Ellis nodded. "I think we should go say thank you to him, for everything he showed us. He didn't have to do that, but he did." They all agreed. And so, they walked toward the area where they had seen him, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wise old man who had made such an impact on their lives. They weren't sure if he would be there, but the thought of thanking him for his kindness and wisdom filled them with gratitude. Even if Mr. Ellis wasn't there to hear their words, they had already begun to change, to live by the lessons he had imparted. They would carry those lessons with them always, and they knew that the kindness they now practiced would be a tribute to the man who had quietly taught them the true meaning of strength. As they walked away from the park that evening, the group was filled with a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. They had learned that true power didn't come from being loud or from putting others down. It came from within, from being the kind of person who chose kindness over cruelty, respect over mockery, and patience over impatience. Mr. Ellis had shown them the way. And now, they were walking it themselves. The weeks that followed continued to shape the teens in ways they never expected. They began to notice subtle changes in their lives, and the realization came slowly, almost imperceptibly. They weren't the same group of teenagers who had approached the old man in the park that fateful day. They weren't as quick to judge, not as eager to take cheap shots or try to prove themselves. Instead, they had started to focus on kindness, respect, and personal growth. One afternoon, as they walked through the park again, they couldn't help but think of Mr. Ellis. His lesson had stayed with them, like an invisible thread connecting them all. They had learned not only to respect others, but also to respect themselves, to recognize the strength it took to stay calm and composed, no matter what the situation. They had learned that it wasn't about being loud or showing off. It was about making the right choices, even when no one was watching. But they hadn't seen him again since that day. The bench where he had sat was still there, empty as always. Sometimes they would walk by and wonder if he would show up again, but he never did. It didn't matter, though. The impact he had made on them was more profound than any one meeting. The old man had shown them a different way to live, one that they carried with them every day. One day, as they were sitting together in the park, one of the teens turned to the others and said, "I really miss Mr. Ellis. I never thought someone like him could make such a difference in our lives." Another nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it feels like he was sent here to teach us something. I don't think we would have learned it any other way." They all sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on everything they had learned. They had been given a second chance, a new perspective on how to treat others, and more importantly, how to treat themselves. It wasn't just about the lessons Mr. Ellis had shared, but about how they had taken those lessons to heart. They had chosen to live differently, and they were proud of that. "Do you think he ever knew how much he changed us?" one of them asked. "I don't think he did it for recognition," another replied. "He was just living his life. But I know he saw something in us, and maybe that's why he decided to teach us. Maybe he saw that we could be better, that we could be stronger, in a way that wasn't about power or strength, but about being decent human beings." They all agreed. The old man had never once raised his voice, never once tried to show off his skills or force them to understand his point. He had simply shared his wisdom, and in doing so, he had left a lasting mark on their hearts. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the park, they all stood up to leave, a sense of peace filling the air. They hadn't found Mr. Ellis that day, but they didn't need to. The lesson he had taught them had already taken root deep within them. It had changed the way they saw the world, and more importantly, the way they saw themselves. They were no longer just a group of teens trying to impress each other or make fun of those around them. They had learned that true strength lay in kindness, in patience, and in choosing to rise above negativity. And though Mr. Ellis was no longer in the park, his presence was still there, lingering in their hearts. Every time they faced a difficult situation, or were tempted to fall back into old habits, they remembered the lesson he had taught them. and they knew that as long as they carried that lesson, they would continue to grow, continue to be better, and continue to be the kind of people who chose peace over conflict, understanding over judgment, and respect over cruelty. The teens walked away from the park that day with a renewed sense of purpose. They had changed, and they knew they would never go back to the way they were. Thanks to the wisdom of one quiet, patient old man, they had learned that strength wasn't about what you could do to others. It was about what you could do for others, and what you could do for yourself. The lesson would stay with them forever.